My husband went to the bank every Tuesday at exactly 2 p.m. I don't mean around 2. I mean 2 p.m. on the dot, like a train schedule written into his bloodstream. For 38 years of marriage, through flu seasons and family emergencies, through snowstorms and heat waves, that ritual never changed. He'd straighten his tie, pick up his worn leather briefcase, kiss my forehead, and say, "Just keeping our future secure, Maggie." Then the door would close, always with that same careful click, and I would hear his car back out of the driveway. I never followed him, never questioned it. Bob was an accountant. Numbers were his language. Order was his comfort. Paying bills, filing taxes, managing investments. Those were his love letters, written in spreadsheets and statements instead of ink. When friends complained about forgetful husbands or chaotic finances, I would smile and think, not Bob, not my husband. Our bills were always paid early. Our mortgage checks never bounced. Every year at tax time, he would bring me a folder to sign, all neatly prepared with sticky notes and little arrows. There would always be that same sentence, half joke, half reassurance. "Don't worry about the boring money stuff, Maggie. I've got it covered." And I believed him. Why wouldn't I? The day Bob died, I was standing in the produce aisle arguing with an avocado. Too hard, too soft, bruised, overripe. It's funny the details you remember when your life is about to split open. My phone rang, and I saw my son David's name on the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail. I was annoyed, distracted, thinking about dinner and grocery lists, and nothing that actually mattered. "Hey, honey, what's—" "Mom." One word, flat, careful. A voice I had never heard from my son before. "You need to come to the hospital. Dad." Dad collapsed at work. It felt like the air thickened around me. The avocados blurred. Someone's child was crying in another aisle. A cart squeaked. An announcement crackled over the speakers about a sale on cereal. The world kept moving, oblivious. By the time I got to the hospital, Bob was already gone. "Massive heart attack," the doctor said. "Quick, sudden. If it's any comfort," he added gently. He probably didn't feel much. As if the way your heart stops can make it hurt less for the people left standing. I didn't cry at the funeral. People noticed. They hugged me with that careful sympathy reserved for widows and said things like, "It hasn't hit her yet, and she must be in shock." I nodded, accepted casseroles, listened to stories about Bob from coworkers and neighbors. I stood there in my black dress, dry-eyed, and felt like I was watching someone else's life from behind glass. But underneath the numbness, there was something else. Not joy, not anything as cruel as that, but relief. A thin, guilty thread of relief pulled tight in my chest. It didn't make sense. Bob hadn't been a bad husband. He wasn't violent or cruel. He didn't cheat, at least as far as I knew. He remembered birthdays and anniversaries. He brought me coffee every morning like clockwork. He kissed my forehead when he left for work, and again when he came home. And yet, standing at his grave, the dirt still raw and dark, I felt like I could finally breathe, like some invisible weight had quietly rolled off my chest. I hated myself for it. I told myself it was just exhaustion, grief, shock, my brain looking for any way to stay afloat. 3 days after the funeral, the letter arrived. Plain white envelope, no return address. My name, Mrs. Margaret Thompson, typed neatly on the front like a label. I almost threw it in the pile with the sympathy cards and bills, but something about its simplicity made me open it right there at the kitchen counter. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the First National Bank logo at the top. I began to read, "Dear Mrs. Thompson, we wish to express our condolences regarding your husband's passing. Per the terms of the safe deposit box lease, we must inform you that you are listed as the secondary holder." I stopped. Safe deposit box. I read the paragraph again, slower this time. Bob had rented a safe deposit box. He'd listed me as secondary holder. The box was paid through the end of the year. I could access it at my earliest convenience. A safe deposit box. In 38 years of marriage, through moves and mortgages, through kids and college and countless boring money conversations he told me not to worry about, Bob had never once mentioned a safe deposit box. My first thought was practical. Maybe it's our wills, important documents, birth certificates. It would make sense, wouldn't it? The accountant husband, storing crucial papers somewhere secure. But there was a feeling, too, a heaviness in my stomach, like the moment right before a storm when the air changes and you don't know why yet. I called the bank. The woman on the phone was polite, professional, and completely unfazed by the idea that my entire world might be hanging on the other end of this conversation. Yes, Mrs. Thompson, we do show you as co-holder on a safe deposit box. Box number 847, rented under Robert Thompson's name. Since when? I asked. My voice sounded strange in my own ears. She tapped keys. Looks like 20 years. 20 years. 2 decades of Tuesday trips. 2 decades of rituals he never explained. Can I see it? Of course. We'll just need to schedule a time in advance. Would Thursday at 10 a.m. work for you? I agreed, thanked her, hung up, and stared at the phone like it might start explaining itself. Thursday was only 2 days away, but it felt like a cliff edge in front of me. The next 48 hours, I moved through the house like a ghost. I opened drawers that Bob had meticulously organized. Files labeled in his precise, slanted handwriting. Insurance paperwork, tax returns, old pay stubs, everything neatly categorized, color-coded, dated, the picture of reliability. Too perfect, too organized, like a stage set built to look like a life. On Wednesday evening, David came by. He looked older than his 36 years. His tie hung loose around his neck. The skin beneath his eyes was shadowed and red. Grief had settled on him like a weight he couldn't adjust. "Mom," he said, dropping into the kitchen chair that had always been Bob's spot. "We need to talk about Dad's finances." My heart skipped. "What about them?" He pulled a folder from his bag and spread out papers on the table. Bank statements, account summaries, documents I'd never seen before. "I've been going through his office," he said. "There are some things that don't add up." I tried to play it off at first. "Your father was always very thorough with money, David. If something doesn't make sense, it's probably because we don't have the full picture yet." He shook his head. "That's what I thought." "But Mom, did you know about these?" He pointed to 3 different statements. Dad had 3 checking accounts. I frowned. "No, we only have the joint one." Or had. The word caught, past tense. I swallowed. "The one with both our names." He nodded slowly. "The joint account. Yes. But these," he tapped the papers, "are separate. All in his name. No mention of you." I picked up the first statement. The balance was 0. Not low. 0. "This one's been empty for 6 months, David said quietly. "This one," he tapped the second, "was closed last year. And this last one," his finger moved to the third paper, "has a balance of $43. I felt my throat go dry. "That doesn't make sense. Our retirement account alone should have over $400,000. "That's what your father always told me." David's expression shifted in that devastating way where the truth is visible before the words arrive. "Mom," he said gently, "I've been looking. I can't find it. Any of it. There's no retirement fund, no investment account with that balance. I've checked every folder, every file. It's not there." The kitchen seemed to tilt, just slightly, like a ship taking on water. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. "That's impossible," I whispered. "He showed me the statements." "Did he?" David asked softly. "Or did he just tell you they were fine?" I opened my mouth to argue and then closed it again, because when I reached for specific memories, I found nothing solid. I remembered Bob talking about our IRA, about moving things around, about market fluctuations and long-term strategies. I remembered him using words like, "Don't worry," and "I've got it." But the actual papers? Sitting together? Going line by line? No. I realized I couldn't picture it. "I'm sure there's an explanation," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. It sounded like I was trying to convince myself more than him. David hesitated. "Maybe the safe deposit box will have answers. Maybe everything's in there." The safe deposit box. Thursday at 10 a.m. The envelope from First National sitting on the counter like a quiet accusation. For the first time since Bob died, the relief I'd felt at the funeral began to make a terrible, twisted kind of sense. Something was wrong. Not just grief wrong. Not just my husband is gone wrong. Something deeper. Older. A secret that had been walking out the door with a briefcase every Tuesday at 2 p.m. for 20 years. I looked at the stack of papers on the table. The empty accounts. The missing retirement. The almost meaningless $43. Clinging to an account like the last coins in a pocket. I pressed my palm flat against the cool wood and made myself a promise. On Thursday, I would open that box. and whatever was inside, I would finally see the truth. On Thursday morning, I woke before the alarm. The sky outside the window was a dull sheet of gray, the kind that made everything feel muted, suspended. I dressed with an unusual sense of deliberateness: navy slacks, a white blouse, a blazer that felt more like armor than clothing. I didn't bother with makeup. There was no face I could paint on that would prepare me for whatever waited inside that box. David offered to come with me. He'd texted late the night before, "Mom, let me go with you, please." But I told him no. Not because I wanted to be brave, but because something inside me, something instinctive and deeply private, knew this was a moment I had to meet alone. If the truth was going to break me, I didn't want an audience. The bank was a modern glass and steel building that looked more like a tech office than a place where people hid secrets. As I walked inside, a woman with a short, immaculate bob and a tailored suit approached me. "Mrs. Thompson?" "Yes. I'm Patricia, the branch manager. I'll take you to the vault." Her tone was gentle, but there was a practiced calm behind it, the tone of someone who had delivered condolences many times and knew how to manage the fragile people left behind. She led me through a long hallway that hummed with air conditioning. The vault door, round and imposing like something out of an old heist film, stood open. Inside, rows of metal boxes covered the walls like a honeycomb of secrets. Patricia slid her key into box 847. "Your key, please." My hand shook only slightly when I inserted it. 2 clicks, like a lock exhaling. She pulled the box out and handed it to me. It was heavier than I expected. Unexpected weight always means something. Patricia gestured to a small private room. "I'll give you privacy. Take as long as you need." Her heels clicked away down the hall, leaving me alone with a simple metal box and the uneasy pulse in my throat. I sat. For a long moment I just stared at it, fingers resting lightly on the lid, as if touching it might unleash something I wasn't ready for. Then I opened it. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Paper. Old and faintly metallic. Inside were folders neatly arranged, labeled in Bob's precise handwriting. Of course, even his secrets were organized. I pulled out the first folder. Investments. Actual. The word actual prickled at me. Why, actual? What had he been showing me all these years? I opened it, and the world narrowed. Page after page of losses. Not small fluctuations. Catastrophic failures. Stocks that had tanked. Funds that had dissolved. Risky ventures that crashed. Hundreds of thousands of dollars gone. My eyes slid down lists of numbers bleeding red. Date after date. Year after year. But what struck me most was the name on every account. Robert Thompson. Only Robert Thompson. Not Margaret. Not joint. Not shared. The retirement fund he'd always claimed was solid. Nowhere. The accounts he'd referenced casually over dinner? Missing. Instead, there were reports of investments he'd made alone, reckless gambles he never told me about. I felt the first crack inside my chest. Not heartbreak. Not yet. Just the sharp, cold sting of betrayal starting to bloom. I set the folder aside and picked up the next one. Home equity loans. 3 of them. I skimmed the documents, my heart pounding harder with each line. Loan amounts, interest rates, signatures, my signature. Except it wasn't mine. Someone had tried to copy it poorly. The curves were wrong, the loops too tight, the angle forced. A sour taste flooded my mouth. 3 loans against our home. The house we'd bought together, painted together, built a life inside. Total debt, $270,000. The walls of the small room felt like they were inching inward, squeezing the air. I pressed a hand to the table, grounding myself, forcing breath into my lungs. I told myself to stop, to take a break, to step outside for air, but I couldn't. I had to keep going. The third folder was thinner, but somehow heavier. Credit accounts. Maggie. My stomach dropped. Inside were copies of 15 credit card applications, all in my name, all signed with forged versions of my signature, all maxed out. Total debt, $96,000. I held my breath, waiting for anger or tears or something, but what came instead was a strange, ringing emptiness, a hollowing out, as if part of me had already known this was coming. My husband, the man who held my hand through childbirth, who danced with our daughter at her wedding, who memorized my coffee order, had stolen my identity. I sat there, closing my eyes, letting the truth settle like dust. For a moment, I felt disembodied, a woman floating above the scene, watching someone else unravel. Then I saw the envelope at the bottom of the box, thick, cream-colored. My name on the front, in Bob's familiar handwriting. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. Inside was a letter. Maggie, if you're reading this, I'm already gone, and you've found the box. I'm sorry, it isn't enough, but it's all I have to offer. I kept reading. He explained everything. The bad investment 5 years ago, his certainty it would pay off, his desperation when it didn't. The Tuesday bank trips, failed attempts to fix a mistake that kept growing. The loans, the credit cards, the lies. I thought I could fix it before you ever had to know. I was wrong. I've ruined everything. You'll hate me. You should, but I loved you, Maggie. That part was always real. I read the letter twice. Then a third time. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't crumble to the floor like in the movies. I just felt cold and startlingly clear. If Bob were alive, I didn't know what I would do. But the dead don't answer for their mistakes. The ones they leave behind do. I placed everything back in the folders, back in the box, back in the manager's hands with a simple request. Copies of everything, and the name of a lawyer who dealt with financial fraud. Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. When I walked out of the bank, the air felt sharper, the sky heavier. I carried the copies like evidence from a crime scene. David's car was already in my driveway when I arrived home. He opened the door before I even reached it, his face drawn with worry. "Mom, what did you find?" I didn't answer. I walked past him into the kitchen, set my purse down with more force than necessary, and spread the documents across the table. "Sit," I said. He sat, and as he read first in confusion, then in shock, then in raw disbelief, I watched the same realization dawn on him that had already settled into me. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. "Mom, this is bad." "Yes, everything is gone." "Yes? How are you so calm?" I sat across from him, folded my hands, and said the only true thing I could say, because anger is useless right now. And what I need is a plan. Jennifer Rodriguez's office sat on the 12th floor of a downtown building. Bright windows, shelves lined with law books, plants that somehow looked both alive and stressed. A city lawyer with calm eyes and a voice that carried its own gravity. David came with me, though I hadn't asked him to. Maybe he didn't want me to face this part alone. Maybe he didn't trust himself to stay home with the questions. Jennifer listened in complete silence as I laid everything out. The safe deposit box, the forged signatures, the loans, the credit cards, the letter Bob had left behind. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask for clarification, didn't even blink at the numbers. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and spoke with a levelness that scared me more than shock would have. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, "I'm going to be direct. This is one of the worst cases of spousal financial abuse I've seen, and I've seen many." The word hit me like a slap. Abuse. I'd heard that word applied to other marriages. Women who hid bruises. Women who whispered confessions behind closed doors. Women who looked shattered in ways that felt visible. Not me. Not my marriage. But Jennifer's tone wasn't sensational. It was clinical, factual. "Your husband systematically destroyed your financial security," she continued. "He forged your signature. He opened credit lines in your name. He took out loans you didn't know about. That's fraud, and it's identity theft, and it's a crime. But he's dead," I said, my voice small. "Dead people still leave consequences," she replied. "Our job is to make sure those consequences don't fall on you." She outlined the path ahead, proving I wasn't complicit, filing disputes with credit bureaus, contacting creditors, building a case against the fraudulent loans, possibly saving the house, months of paperwork, possibly a court battle. "How long will this take?" I asked. 6 months, she said. "Maybe a year, and how much will it cost?" Her pause told me everything before her words did. A lot. I thought of the $43 in our checking account, the stacks of debt, the empty retirement, the crumbling remains of the life I thought I'd had. Then I thought of Bob's letter, the careful handwriting, the line "I was trying to protect you." I sat straighter. "Tell me what we need to do." That night, Emily called. My daughter had always been closer to Bob. He'd been her math tutor, her first call during breakups, the parent she idolized. I'd expected tears, comfort, shared disbelief. Instead, after I told her what I'd found in the bank box, There was only silence. A long, stretching silence that made my chest tighten. "Mom," she said finally, her voice thin. "Are you sure? Maybe there's an explanation?" "I have the documents," I said gently. "I have the loan papers, the forged signatures. I have his letter." He admitted it. "That doesn't sound like Dad," she whispered. "He would never do that. He loved you. He loved us." "He did," I said. "And he also made terrible choices. Both things can be true." It was the wrong thing to say, or maybe the only honest thing. Either way, she wasn't ready to hear it. "Mom, grief can make you misinterpret things. You need to slow down. Don't destroy his memory because you're hurting." "I'm not destroying anything," I said quietly. "He did that himself." She hung up, and the silence she left behind was louder than the words. David called an hour later, clearly having spoken to her. "She's upset," he said. "I know. She'll come around." "I'm not sure." Because I had seen this before in other families, someone clings so tightly to the version of a loved one they need to believe in that the truth becomes unacceptable, no matter how clear. The next weeks were a blur of legal steps. Jennifer filed disputes with credit bureaus. She contacted the credit card companies. She assembled evidence. She requested handwriting analysis. David became my right hand sorting documents, organizing folders, creating spreadsheets that mapped out the chaos Bob had left behind. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at the papers with an expression that wasn't anger or grief, but a hollow mix of both. One evening, while we sat at the kitchen table sifting through yet another stack of statements, David cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, "I need to tell you something." My heart dropped. Bad news had become a constant companion. I braced myself. "A few years ago," he said slowly, "Dad asked me to invest in something with him. A startup. He said it was a sure thing, guaranteed return. He wanted me to put in the entire $50,000 I'd saved for the kids' college." My chest tightened. "David." "I almost did," he admitted. "I trusted him. He said he needed help. He looked desperate." The word hit me harder than the rest. Desperate. I thought of the Tuesday bank trips, the empty accounts, the letters, the loans, the forged signatures. "But Sarah didn't trust it," David continued. "She asked me why. If it was such a sure thing, he needed our money. We had a huge fight about it. I was angry, but she held her ground. So I told Dad no. And how did he react?" David looked down. He looked at me like I'd taken something from him, like I'd failed him. He swallowed, voice low. "I think he was already drowning, Mom, and he wanted to use my money to fix his mistakes." I reached for his hand and squeezed. "But you didn't give it to him," I said. "Sarah saved you. That's what matters." He nodded, but his eyes were haunted. "Do you think he would have kept going?" he asked. "Taking from more people?" I thought of the forged signatures, the loans, the credit cards, the desperate apology. "I think," I said carefully, "that drowning people grab onto whatever they can, even if it pulls others under." David didn't speak again. He didn't have to. 3 months after Bob's death, the first small victory arrived. 2 credit card companies accepted the forged signatures and cleared the debt from my name. It wasn't much, a tiny opening, a corner of light in a world that had felt entirely dark. But it was something, a sign that the truth could win, even if it came slowly. Emily still wasn't talking to me. She had sent a short email. "I need space. I can't handle the way you're talking about Dad. I don't believe it. I think grief is making you irrational." I didn't reply. What could I say? What words existed for a daughter who needed her father to be perfect so badly she couldn't see the damage he'd done? Some bridges burn slowly, some all at once. Some you don't know are burning until they're already ash. The lawyer handling the home equity loans was a different challenge, cold, aggressive, insisting that as Bob's spouse, I had benefited from the marriage and therefore the loans. Jennifer countered with evidence. The separate accounts, the forged signatures, the letter, the pattern. But the bank refused to concede. So we were left with only one option. "We have to go to court," Jennifer said. I nodded, even as dread pooled low in my stomach. "How hard will it be to win?" She paused, choosing her words. "I think we have a strong case. But I can't guarantee anything. This is complicated." Of course it was. Nothing about my life was simple anymore. The hearing was set for late November, 6 months after Bob's death. And that was the moment I realized something. I needed a job. Not because it would solve everything, but because I needed stability. I needed the sense of control I'd lost the moment I opened that metal box. At 64, I wasn't exactly an ideal candidate. I'd been a stay-at-home mother, then a part-time librarian, then retired. Now, I was a woman with no savings, no retirement, and an avalanche of debt that technically wasn't mine, but still clung to my name. I printed resumes. I circled job postings. I rehearsed answers. Then someone called me back. A little bookstore downtown. A woman named Ruth. A chance small, but mine. And as I got ready for that interview, I realized something surprising. For the first time in months, I felt almost steady. Not safe, not healed, but steady. As if the ground beneath me, though cracked, was beginning to hold. Ruth's bookstore sat between a florist and a bakery, tucked into a corner of downtown like a secret you could only find if you knew where to look. The bell above the door chimed softly when I walked in for the interview, releasing the scent of old paper and something floral lavender. Maybe. It felt warm, safe, like stepping into a different kind of life, one that didn't know anything about forged signatures or loans or betrayal. Ruth herself looked like someone who had lived several lives already and survived all of them. Silver hair in a loose braid, red-framed glasses, eyes sharp as the edge of truth. She held my resume lightly, as if she already knew the paper in her hand was only a fraction of who I was. "You worked as a librarian," she said, scanning the page. "You were married nearly 4 decades, and now you're looking for work." She looked up. "May I ask why?" For a moment, I considered lying, saying I was bored. I wanted a hobby. I needed to stay active. But lies were how my life had fallen apart in the first place. I was tired of them, his, mine, the ones we both accepted for years. "My husband died 6 months ago," I said. "And 2 weeks ago, I found out he'd stolen my identity and destroyed our finances. I need a job because I'm trying to keep my house." Ruth's expression softened not with pity, but with recognition. She set the resume down gently, like it was something fragile. "When can you start?" she asked. I began working 3 days a week. It didn't pay much, but for the first time since Bob died, I felt like I was building something small, humble, but mine. I learned how to organize inventory, how to recommend books based on nothing but a customer's expression, how to slice open boxes without slicing open a finger. And Ruth became a quiet place to lean. Someone who didn't ask too many questions, but somehow always knew when I needed to talk. Still, the court date loomed. Every morning I woke with a tightness in my chest, a reminder that no job, no bookstore, no new friend could untangle the mess Bob had left for me to clean up. November arrived cold and damp, the air smelling of wet leaves and change. The court hearing was on a Thursday. David insisted on coming with me. Emily did not. She'd sent a text the night before. "I can't watch you do this to Dad's name. I'm sorry." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "I understand. I love you." She didn't respond. Walking into the courthouse felt like stepping into a memory I didn't belong, in tall ceilings, echoing footsteps, the quiet hum of solemn decisions. The courtroom itself was smaller than it looked on television, the wood darker, the air heavier. The judge, Harrison, sat like a man accustomed to being the final word in people's unraveling. The bank's lawyer went first. Young, polished, confident in the way of men who'd never had to rebuild anything from ashes. He argued that as Bob's spouse, I had benefited from the marriage, and therefore the loans. He said I lived in the house. He said I shared the life. He said, whether I signed the papers or not, the debt was tied to me because of my proximity to the man who created it. His words felt cold, technical, like he was discussing numbers on a spreadsheet instead of the pieces of my life. Then Jennifer stood. She didn't raise her voice, didn't show anger. She simply laid out the facts with surgical precision. The forged signatures, the expert handwriting analysis, the bank records showing accounts solely in Bob's name, the letter Bob had left confessing the fraud, the pattern of deception that went back years. She spoke like someone holding a lantern in a dark room, revealing everything exactly as it was. Then she called me to the stand. My palms were damp as I walked up. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. But when I sat down and placed my hand on the Bible, something steadied inside me. "Mrs. Thompson," Jennifer began, "when did you first learn about these loans?" "When I opened the safe deposit box after my husband's death," I said. "In your 38 years of marriage, did your husband ever discuss taking out loans on your home?" "No." "Did you receive any of the funds from these loans?" "No. The money went into accounts I didn't know existed." Did you sign any of these loan applications? No. When she was finished, the bank's lawyer rose for cross-examination. He moved with the precision of someone sharpening a knife. Mrs. Thompson, he said, isn't it true that you trusted your husband with the finances? Yes. So you chose not to be involved in financial decisions? I met his eyes. I trusted him. That's not the same as choosing to be defrauded. He blinked, thrown off for a second, then regrouped. But you benefited from the house. You lived in it. You occupied the property for decades. That is undeniable, correct? I lived in my home, I said. The one my husband and I bought together 40 years ago. The one he put at risk without my knowledge or consent. His jaw tightened. Are you asking the court to believe that in nearly 4 decades, you never suspected anything? That question, that was the wound. The one I'd been carrying silently. The one that stung every night as I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I took a breath. My husband was an accountant. He was meticulous, organized, trustworthy. Or so I thought. He hid his mistakes behind competence, behind routine, behind my trust, behind 38 years of marriage where I believed love meant not questioning. The courtroom was quiet, a stillness that felt almost tender. Was I naive? I continued. Probably. But naivete is not consent to fraud. The judge called a recess. We waited in the hallway. David paced. Jennifer checked her phone. I sat on a wooden bench, hands clasped tightly, staring straight ahead. You did great, Mom, David said. But I wasn't thinking about the testimony. I was thinking about Emily, my daughter, who couldn't accept that her father had been capable of something so terrible, who needed the lie more than she needed the truth. After an hour, we were called back. Judge Harrison looked at both sides, then at me. His voice was firm, clear. I've reviewed all the evidence, he said. The forged signatures, the expert testimony, the written admission of the deceased. While I understand the bank's position, I cannot ignore the clear evidence of fraud committed without Mrs. Thompson's knowledge or consent. He paused. I rule in favor of the defendant. The loans are void. The liens on the property are hereby released. David exhaled sharply, grabbing my hand. Jennifer gave me a small, victorious smile. But as we walked out of the courthouse, the cold air biting at my cheeks, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, older, hollow. Because yes, I had my house. Yes, my name was clearing. Yes, the truth had prevailed. But I had also lost something that couldn't be restored. The marriage I thought I'd had, the man I thought I'd known, and a daughter who still couldn't forgive me for telling the truth. That night, the phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but when I saw Emily's name on the screen, something inside me whispered, "Pick up." I pressed accept. "Mom." Her voice was thick, trembling. "I need to tell you something." Emily's voice on the phone didn't sound like the daughter who had been avoiding me for months. It sounded younger, like the little girl who used to crawl into my lap after nightmares. Fragile. Lost. "Mom," she said again. "After the hearing today, I went to the bank. My breath caught, but I didn't interrupt her. I asked to see Dad's records. The ones you showed the lawyer. I wanted to prove you wrong." A shaky inhale. "But you weren't wrong. It was all there. Everything you said." I closed my eyes. "And there was more." I gripped the edge of the table. "More. He had a credit card in my name too," she whispered. "I never opened it. I never saw it. But it's there. $23,000. My credit is ruined." Her voice broke. "Mom, how could he do that to me? To you? To us?" My heart fractured in a new way, not from betrayal, but from the pain of watching my daughter's image of her father collapse. "Oh, Emily," I said softly. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to believe you," she cried. "I thought you were angry or confused or, I don't know. I just couldn't imagine that Dad would do something like this. He helped me with math homework. He made pancakes shaped like hearts. How could that person also do this?" "Because both versions were real," I said. "The man who loved you and the man who made terrible choices. People aren't just one thing." Silence. Then, in a tiny voice, "Can I come over?" "Of course, sweetheart, anytime." She arrived an hour later. I made tea the way she liked it, extra honey, no lemon. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where David and I had sifted through debt and lies, and now it became a place for healing. Emily wept as she talked. Not loud or dramatic, just quiet, exhausted sobs that shook her shoulders. I held her hands, let her speak, let her break. Some wounds have to split open before they can close. Over the next few weeks, Jennifer helped Emily file disputes, just as she had for me. David came over often, and for the first time in months, the three of us sat together not as a family broken by scandal, but as a family rebuilding from truth. At the bookstore, life settled into a strange, comforting rhythm. Ruth had a way of sensing things without asking. One slow afternoon, as we restocked the mystery section, she told me about her own marriage. He wasn't dishonest about money, she said, sliding books neatly into place. Just everything else. Other women. Other lies. Other lives. She glanced at me. When I finally left, everyone told me I was overreacting. That all marriages have problems. That I should try harder. Her mouth twitched into a wry smile. But you know what I learned? The people who tell you to try harder are usually the ones who've never had to try at all. Her words settled into me like stones, heavy, grounding, honest. One day, a woman wandered into the bookstore, looking pale and nervous. She hovered near the self-help section, touching spines of books but not pulling any out. Something about her posture, shoulders curved in, eyes a little glassy, felt familiar. I walked over gently. "Can I help you find something?" She hesitated. Then, in a small voice, "Do you have anything about financial abuse in marriage?" My breath caught. I found 3 books and handed them to her. And then, without planning to, I said softly, "I have experience with this, if you want to talk." She looked up sharply, searching my face, and then something cracked. She nodded. We talked for an hour in the corner of the store. Her story wasn't mine, but it rhymed in the ways these stories so often do. Control disguised as care, isolation disguised as protection, manipulation disguised as love. When she left, she hugged me. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing me." After she walked out, Ruth gave me a long look. "You're good at that," she said. "At what?" "Listening, believing, not judging." I paused, thinking of the months when Emily didn't believe me. When people pulled away because the truth of my marriage made them uncomfortable. "I know what it's like not to be believed," I said quietly. Word spread. Not publicly, not loudly, but quietly, through whispers, through women who told their friends, through people who recognized something in my eyes. More women came. 12, then 15, then 20. They came with different stories but the same patterns. Silent suffering, confusion, shame that wasn't theirs to carry. Ruth and I started a small support group that met once a month in the back room of the bookstore. Just a circle of chairs, a pot of coffee, and women sharing the things they'd been taught never to say out loud. I shared my story at the first meeting. The Tuesday rituals, the safe deposit box, the forged signatures, the court battle, the daughter who didn't believe me until she did. "How did you stay strong?" someone asked. "I didn't," I said honestly. I cried. I panicked. I felt stupid and ashamed. But I kept moving forward anyway, because the alternative was giving up. And I had spent too many years letting someone else make my choices. A ripple of quiet agreement passed through the room. One evening, after a particularly emotional meeting, Ruth and I sat alone in the bookstore with cheap wine in paper cups. The lights were dim, the shelves casting long shadows. "You know what you're doing, right?" she asked. I looked at her. "What?" "Building a legacy. Bob tried to destroy you, leave you with nothing. Instead, you're helping other women avoid the same fate. You're taking what hurt you and turning it into something that helps others." She raised her cup. "That's not survival, Maggie. That's transformation." The word sat between us, soft, powerful. Transformation. I'd spent months trying to get back to the woman I used to be, the one who trusted, the one who believed her marriage was solid, the one who thought safety came from someone else taking care of things. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was becoming someone new, someone forged in fire, not broken by it. A year after Bob's death, we held the anniversary meeting of the support group. 23 women sat in a circle. Some had become close friends. Others were new, their hands twisting nervously in their laps. I looked around at them, women who had survived lies, betrayal, silence, fear. Women who were rebuilding, brick by careful brick. "When my husband died," I began, "I thought my life was over. And in some ways, it was. The life I thought I had, the marriage I believed in, the future I imagined." I took a breath, but something else was born too. Not immediately, not easily, but slowly. A new version of me, One who demands honesty. One who doesn't apologize for asking questions. One who chooses herself. After the meeting, a young woman lingered, barely 35, eyes full of worry. "My husband handles all our money," she said. "He says I'm bad with numbers. He tells me not to look at the accounts. But something feels wrong." I took her hands gently. "Trust that feeling. Ask questions. Look at everything. Don't let anyone keep you in the dark about your own life." "What if I'm wrong?" she whispered. "Then you feel foolish for 5 minutes. But if you're right," I squeezed her hands, "you could save yourself from losing everything." The next month, she returned with documents in hand. Her husband had drained their joint savings into crypto investments that had vanished. She'd filed for divorce the day before. "I'm terrified," she said, "but I'm also free." I nodded. I knew exactly what she meant. The morning of what would have been my 39th wedding anniversary arrived quietly gray, light spilling through the kitchen windows, the kettle humming on the stove, the house still. A year ago, I'd woken with a ring on my finger and a life I thought I understood. Now, I woke with something else entirely. My own name, my own future, and a strange sense of calm that felt like earned ground. By then, the support group had become a small ecosystem of its own, steady, evolving, full of women who had learned to speak truth into rooms that once frightened them. Emily's credit report was finally cleared, her financial slate painstakingly restored. David had taken the $50,000 he once almost handed to Bob and moved it into a tightly secured college fund for his kids, untouchable, unshakable. And me? I still worked at Ruth's bookstore, 3 days a week, loving the routine of it, the small joys of recommending the perfect novel to a teenager or finding a forgotten classic for a collector. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was honest, and it was mine. When I stepped outside that morning, the air had that early winter bite I'd come to expect in Portland. I wrapped my coat tighter around me as I walked toward the bank, a different bank, one Bob had never walked into, one with no connection to the life I'd left behind. The lobby was warm, with soft music playing overhead and a faint smell of coffee drifting from somewhere behind the counters. A young teller smiled at me. "How can I help you today?" "I'd like to open a new account," I said. "Of course. In your name?" I hesitated just a moment. Then, "Yes, my name." She gestured for me to follow her to a small desk. As I sat down, I felt a strange flutter in my chest, not nerves exactly, but something adjacent, a quiet, powerful shift. "What name should I put on the account?" she asked, clicking into a form. I looked down at my hands, the hands of a 64-year-old woman who had spent decades trusting someone else to steer the ship, the hands of a woman who had signed documents with a last name that no longer matched the person she was becoming. "Not Thompson," I said softly. "My maiden name, Sullivan." The teller typed it in with a smile. "Welcome back, Miss Sullivan." I felt tears prick my eyes, not from sadness, but from the quiet recognition of a self I hadn't spoken aloud in years. When I left the bank, the sky had brightened. Not sunny, not warm, but lighter. I walked slowly, letting the crisp air clear my thoughts. For the first time in a long while, I felt steady on my own 2 feet, no secrets, no shadows, no fog. Later that afternoon, I headed to the bookstore for our monthly support group meeting. Ruth had already set out the chairs in the back room, 24 of them now, arranged in a circle. A table in the corner held coffee, tea, and a plate of cookies one of the women had brought. They began trickling in, some with tentative smiles, some with cautious eyes, some with expressions that said, "I'm not okay, but I'm here." Each woman carried her own story, her own heartbreak, her own quiet awakening. When everyone settled, I stood up. "1 year ago," I began, "I opened a safe deposit box, and my life fell apart. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my home, my future, disintegrated in one afternoon, and for a long time, I thought that was the end." A ripple of empathy stirred through the circle. "But endings," I continued, "can also be beginnings. Pain can be a door, loss can be a teacher, and sometimes the person you become after everything shatters is stronger than the person you were before." I caught sight of the young woman from last month, the one whose husband drained their savings. She was sitting straighter now, shoulders less curled inward. "When I found out what Bob had done," I said, "I felt foolish. I felt naive. I felt angry. But mostly, I felt alone. And I don't want any woman in this room to feel alone ever again." Heads nodded. A few eyes glistened. "We're here," I said. "Not to judge, not to shame, but to see each other. To believe each other. To rebuild together." A soft murmur of agreement filled the room. After the meeting, as women chatted and exchanged numbers, Ruth stood beside me, her arms crossed gently, her eyes studying me with that quiet perceptiveness she seemed to carry everywhere. "You know," she said, "you're very different from the woman who walked in here a year ago." "How so?" "You walk differently. Shoulders back, eyes clear." She smiled. "You wear your name honestly now. That changes a person." I laughed, surprised by how true it felt. "Transformation," she added, sipping her tea. "Remember?" I remember. It was the word she'd offered me months ago. The word that felt too heavy then and perfectly right now. Emily came over that evening. She brought takeout from the Thai place she used to visit with Bob, and for the first time, the association didn't sting. We ate at the kitchen table, just the two of us, talking about her work, David's kids, the man she had started seeing. At one point, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you, Mom." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't overly emotional. It was simple, sincere, and it meant more to me than she probably knew. "I'm proud of you too," I said. "You faced something incredibly painful, and you didn't run from it." She smiled, the old softness returning to her eyes. Maybe strength runs in the family. Maybe it did. Maybe it always had. That night, after Emily left, I sat alone in the quiet of the living room. I looked around the house, the walls Bob and I had painted together, the rug we'd argued over, the kitchen where we'd shared decades of meals. The ghosts didn't hurt anymore. They didn't even whisper. They simply existed, pieces of a life I had lived, loved, and outgrown. I thought of all the women in my support group, all the versions of me sitting in that circle, all the lives that had cracked open only to find strength beneath the fracture lines. And I realized something. Bob had tried to erase me, not maliciously, but through secrecy, desperation, and choices he believed I couldn't handle. But he failed. I was still here, still standing, still building, still choosing. So if you're reading this, if any part of my story feels familiar, the locked drawers, the uneasy feelings, the answers that don't add up, the voice inside you whispering something's wrong, trust yourself. Ask questions. Look at the documents. Open the boxes, literal or metaphorical. Don't let anyone tell you that love requires blindness. Love requires truth, respect, partnership. And if the truth breaks your world open, if you lose the things you thought were unshakable, if you find yourself standing in the ruins of a life that wasn't what you believed, remember this. You are stronger than you know. The person who tried to erase you did not succeed. You're still here, and that means you can rebuild. I did, and so can you.